Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, Karen, thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, you've written a thrilling book which made me think a ton as I was working through it and reading through it, and excited for that to be released this week. And just really looking forward to everything you have to share. But it's called The Evangelical Imagination, which is a title that piqued my curiosity from the get-go. But I think, like many people listening and future readers as well, there's a bit of an ignorance as to what that entails, what it speaks to, what it represents. So I wonder, could you give listeners an overview, both of the emergence of evangelicalism in the wake of the Reformation, but also what the phrase the evangelical imagination actually refers to?
Great question. In the process of writing this book, when I was talking about it and using my working title, which turned out to be the actual title, a lot of people thought I was just going to be talking about like the Chronicles of Narnia and The Hobbit or something, which I mentioned, I think, some of those, but that's really not what the book is about. The book is about evangelicalism as it began 300 years ago with the evangelical revival in England and in the Great Awakenings in America. And I basically, I give a lot of that history because a lot of people, we use the word evangelical now as in headlines, as in, surveys and polls and opinion pieces. And people often think of it as a very political term or a very, contested, controversial term. But the movement itself is 300 years old and has a basic definition and some differing definitions, which I give in the book. And we have that, but then we also have, as evangelicals, what Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary. And a social imaginary, as I talk about in the book, is basically sort of a collective or communal pool of images, myths, legends, stories, metaphors that shape us really at the precognitive level. So it's not necessarily something that we're thinking about, but it's so powerful and so much a part of our community that we don't even realize it's driving us. A really basic example, which I talk about in the book, but in a different context, one that has nothing to do with, it does have to do with the evangelicals, but it's outside of that, is the American dream. You can be in America or North America, it doesn't matter. And you just, there's this sense that we all have, whether we use the term or think about it consciously or not, that we are supposed to have some sort of level of success and supposed to fulfill some, vision for what the good life is as related to freedom and prosperity. Again, we don't even have to articulate it, but it's so much a part of our community that if we reach it, it's because we expected it. If we don't reach it, we feel some disappointment or lack of success because it's just so much part of our makeup, especially, in America. It's been here since the founding. And so as evangelicals, we have similar sort of driving metaphors, images, and ideas that make us think, even before, whether consciously or not, like what does it mean to be an evangelical? What does it mean to live in the world as an evangelical Christian? And why do I think this? And so I go through and just kind of try to identify what those lasting sort of images and metaphors are that have driven the movement for 300 years.
Yeah. Would you say that something like Christian nationalism is deeply formed by social imagination as well?
Absolutely. So I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question. I was going to say Christian nationalism, I would argue, is not a central component of the evangelical social imaginary in 300 years. But the reverse, that, as you put it, I think is true. There are certain other ideas
Mm,
that I think lend itself to this emerging, concept of Christian nationalism, which is very controversial. I would argue that the things that that evangelicalism is rooted in and that drove us for 300 years are contrary to that, and that Christian nationalism is formed by maybe some other competing ideas from
mm,
other kinds of social imaginaries. Because another point I make in the book is that there's no one social imaginary
right.
for anyone living in a community. There's no one evangelical social imaginary. There's no one American social imaginary. There are social imaginaries.
Hmm.
And if we were using Venn diagrams, we could have a lot of fun sort of seeing the overlap. But that's what makes them so hard. It's not, and
Yeah.
tricky. They're not, it's not a linear, objective, rational, conscious way of
Hmm.
thinking. It's just part of our imagination,
Yeah.
which is, why I titled the book as I did.
And it's part of what makes it fascinating. And it, as I was reading, what came to mind that uh, I don't have the academic chops to go super in depth on this, but just realizing it would seem that the implication is depending on what social imaginary has most profoundly shaped your worldview, your
Mm-hmm.
entire understanding of reality can be completely different than even somebody you live next door to, let alone somebody that's, on the other side of the world. So it's worth understanding those forces, not only for the sake of understanding each other, but understanding ourselves. So maybe to kind of start from square one in some ways, you write about this, you say that we can't desire what we can't imagine. And I wonder if you could unpack that quote a little bit for us, especially its implication for the way, yeah, that we perceive the world, our sense of reality, our sense of identity, our sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, again, our imagination, it can be something that's conscious that we can sit and think, oh, I'm envisioning what my day tomorrow will look like. And to do that, I'm using my imagination. But there are also, imagination is so big that that it's also includes sort of underlying precognitive things that, as I mentioned before, an easier example maybe to think about is the way that marketing and commercials and advertising work on us, where they
Mm,
give us an image and we might think about it at that moment and think, oh, that looks really good to me. I would like to have that pizza. That happens to me all the time. but marketing and advertising works in a much bigger way too. Is we don't have to be consciously thinking about it to then just sort of have something trigger us later on to want that item that flashed before us before that we might not even have thought about. And so the so that's, I mean, again, it's very, very basic, but how could I ever desire a pizza if I'd never had one put before me? Sorry,
mm.
I don't know why I keep thinking about pizza, but I do.
Hey, it's good.
The pizza commercials always work on me. Um, so it's just, we have to have some sort of vision put before us, some idea, some concept. This is in our imagination before we can actually even desire it.
Mm,
I think I include this in the book. It's that famous passage from C.S. Lewis, which is famous for a good reason, where he talks about the child, who can't imagine a holiday at the sea.
right,
He doesn't want that, but he's just content making mud pies because that's all he knows. So he can't,
right.
and so his desires are too easily satisfied because that's all that he knows. And that's kind of what I'm talking about there.
Yeah, yeah. Would you say, like, as an educator, that that's one of your primary privileges and maybe even challenges, is to invite people out of the limited perspectives they've held into new perspectives, new, well, imaginaries?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably what all educators do, but I think
Mhm.
it's especially easy and exciting for me because I teach literature.
Right.
And that's really what literature does. I mean, literature just allows us to have sort of a front row seat to other lives and other stories, and to watch people go through some sort of situation or some drama. And we go along for the ride, and we can say, oh, don't do that, or do that, or why did you do that, or we predict the outcome, or we judge the character. That's what reading literature is all about. And so we are actually able to imagine through reading literature all kinds of things that we would never be exposed to. And it's not just plots and situations, it's even emotional situations, such as an example that I think of now and then is that's not, we often think of like just romance and love, but it's so much more nuanced than that. I was teaching Great Expectations one time, and in Great Expectations, Pip is raised by his older sister because he's an orphan, and his sister is just really cruel and actually abusive to him. And of course, that was a cruel kind of abusive world that Charles Dickens was writing about. And so we actually, in my class, we talked about, whether or not Pip's sister loved Pip. And we had a really interesting discussion, and she was cruel and abusive, but I had a student come to me after class who came from not quite as dramatically a cruel situation, but a somewhat cruel family situation. And she was able to sort of imagine how in her own way, her mother did love her, even though, she, her behavior and her, she was not good toward her, but it just expanded her ability to understand and to see and imagine that love can be deformed and it can be inadequate, but it can still be a person's attempt to love. And it was really transformative for her. Now, that doesn't excuse or bad behavior or justify anything, but it just allows us to see how human beings, it's just so hard sometimes to be human and to love one another well.
Yes, and to realize that for some people, they're living up to the highest standard or the greatest exposure to what love looks like.
Right.
And it could still be very broken.
Right.
It takes a lot of courage and maturity. Kudos to your student for being able to navigate that. That's not easy. Karen, I loved reading and thinking through the section where you touch on The Apostles of Reason by Molly Worthen. And you talk about how she explores these competing claims of authority in evangelicalism. And the reason it stood out to me, and maybe for listeners tuning in, is that as a pastor, I find myself, often saying, why are there people in the same church, some of whom will say, like yes to modern science, and others who will say like no, or like yes to this and like no to that, and both seem like equally devout and sincere. And so, Worthen talks about these competing claims of authority surrounding evangelicalism, and she highlights that they're pietism and enlightenment, and they're pulling evangelicals in opposite directions. It's like, who are we? What do we belong to? And so, could you speak to like how do pietism and enlightenment form, and then even sometimes divide the evangelical imagination?
That's such a good question, and I really commend this book to anyone who wants to do an even deeper dive into this. Apostles of Reason. It's a really great book, so when Worthen is talking about sort of this tension between the pietist impulse and the Enlightenment ideals that is what really gave birth to evangelicalism. Another way of putting that is to talk about sort of the religion of the heart versus the religion of the head, sort of like and of course we know the Reformation, if we go back to the Reformation, that really was about the head, right? It was about getting doctrine correct and stopping the abuses of the church and focusing on all the five solas, and that's doctrine, that's thinking. And when evangelicals who came out of that, who were very much Reformation Christians, but coming from a Puritan strain that emphasizes like personal holiness, and having a personal conversion experience and a personal relationship with Jesus, that it's those two strains that gave birth to evangelicalism. And so it's not just that the movement is divided by the, sort of the heart versus the head, which, by the way, they are not opposed to one another, right? It should be both. But
Yeah.
it's us as individuals. But because we come from a culture and a movement and a modern world that has separated those two things falsely, for in many ways, we don't know how to exist in that tension either. So no one's going to say they don't believe in science. Well, very few people are going to say they don't believe in science, but they're not going to say they don't believe in personal experience and the personal relationship with Jesus. But what we don't really have or don't know, and this is kind of the, one of the theses of Molly's book, is we don't know how to reconcile them, and we don't know that we don't know that there's a tension there. And so I think there's a place where she says that evangelicals in many ways are sort of like the first moderns and also the first postmoderns, simply because of this tension, because we can think that we are appealing to objective authority a la the Enlightenment, when in fact we may not realize it, but we're appealing to our own subjective experience. And so if we don't know the difference or aren't aware of the tension, we're always going to be pulled by one or the other unawares. And that's what modernity is. And also, ultimately, I think that's what postmodernity shows.
Well, and is it fair to say that evangelicalism is this attempt at a third way that endorses the orthodoxy of fundamentalism, but kind of divests itself of the anti-intellectualism of fundamentalism while simultaneously embracing the intellectualism of the Enlightenment, while disavowing itself of the unorthodox progressivism of the Enlightenment? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I might have to have you back up and go over that again, but it sounds right. I mean, this is where if another book that is part of this conversation, has an important part in this conversation, is Mark Knowles' The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, where he talks about the anti-intellectualism of evangelicalism, and it is founded in that same tension where we want to appeal to subjective experience on the one hand, yet at the same time we are products of the Enlightenment, because we come out of because we're part of the Reformation.
Right. Yeah. Truth and experience. Well, that ties in well with the quote I wanted to share with you. Your writing, but to share with our listeners and invite you to unpack a bit. You say this. You say we must take an account of and study not only our dreams, but the images, metaphors, and stories that fill our dreams and our waking lives too. Such study doesn't require reading scholarly books or taking classes. Sometimes the most fruitful study is simply listening to the experiences of others, enlarging our perspective, not replacing subjective experience for objective truth, but rather seeking to understand how Jesus, the Logos at the center of all creation, accommodates all human experience. Only when that same Logos is at our center can our experiences be rightly ordered and understood. And so I wondered, could you explore this concept, that especially that Jesus is that truth that can accommodate all of human experience, but also make sense of it, order it rightly, and understand it rightly? Can you unpack that for our listeners?
Well, I can try. I think, we as evangelicals, we all believe in truth with a capital T. We believe that Jesus is the truth. And at the same time, I just see increasingly, this is especially true of sort of, I don't know, the past few years, I guess, just sort of an inability or discomfort or resistance to listening to other people's experiences and ideas with whom we disagree. There's a defensiveness or an insularity. And I want to say, as someone who believes that Jesus is the truth and believes in the objectivity of truth and scriptural authority, that I believe in it so much that I can listen to anyone's experience, try to understand that person's experience, have empathy, try to enter into what it is that they're going through, and understand it through the lens of truth. Even if I may not be able to do that, I may, in my finiteness as a human being, yet ultimately I believe that even if I can't do it, Jesus can, and the truth with a capital T can. And so, I mean, really, I guess it's sort of a famous example now, and an obvious one, if for some people controversial, but I think it makes the point very well. This is Tim Keller said this a long time ago. I'm just paraphrasing him, but it's something along the lines of, if you opposed homosexual behavior, until and then changed your mind because someone you know or love, you learned that someone that you know or love is homosexual, then your opposition to it in the first place was wrong. I mean, you're the reason for your opposition. So, in other words, so you could hold to something that you think is the truth, and then if you encounter some other idea and you change it, and it's that idea is not founded in truth, then the whole foundation of your original idea was wrong, is what Tim was saying. And so, not to make this overly complicated, but simply, if our subjective experience changes what we understand to be true, which of course we are often wrong, the real question we have to ask is, is what is the objective truth? And was I wrong before, or is it just that truth can accommodate this other experience in a way that I haven't thought of before? I don't know if that's helpful or not.
It raises insights and questions and all the good things. So yeah. Well, thank you. It does make me think a lot about what role we see truth playing in our personal experiences. And what lens comes first when trying to interpret what's going on around us and going on inside of us. So
that's exactly it. Yes.
Maybe that'll be our next conversation. I'm intrigued, Karen. I'd love for you to unpack in speaking about the reality of evangelicals deeply advocating for faith to not simply be cultural, but to be marked by a personal conversion experience. You use the phrase conversion as a revolution. Obviously not like French Revolution, but can you speak to what you mean by that and what the implications are for people who advocate a faith that is marked by conversion, what that should look like as it's worked out in their everyday lives?
Well, of course, conversion is one of the first sort of metaphors that I talk about in the book. And of course, conversion is literal, it's metaphorical. Everything that's literal is also metaphorical, because all language is metaphorical, which I talk about a little bit more in a different part of the book. But so conversion is important in the evangelical imagination, I point out, because conversion is actually one of the 4 characteristics of evangelicalism as it is demonstrated across denominations and across, geography and time. This is part of Bebbington's quadrilateral, where he
Good old Bebbington.
He identifies what is evangelicalism, because it's obviously not just doctrine. It's not just related to a denomination or a time period or a place. And conversion is one of the central aspects of evangelicalism from the beginning, that emphasis on an individual conversion experience, as opposed to simply nominal Christianity, which is really what characterized the early 18th century, when the evangelical revival began. Was, there was a state church in England. There still is a state church. And so if you were born in that time and place, then you were sort of automatically a Christian. And so the idea of having an individual conversion experience was not emphasized as much as the evangelicals thought that it should be. And we still do, relatively speaking. I mean, that's still a hallmark of evangelicalism. And so, in this chapter on conversion, I give sort of the history of why conversion became important within the evangelical imagination, because there was a lack of emphasis on it. And so evangelicals came along and emphasized it. And, I do believe as an evangelical that, one must be converted in order to be saved, and that there is some sort of conversion experience that one must have in order to be a Christian. But I say also, centering on that metaphor, we can overemphasize that. We can overemphasize it so that we end up, putting too much focus on new converts and not enough on discipleship of those converts, for example, or having, gigantic stadiums and congregations and altar calls just to get people to raise their hand or fill out a card or come forward, without making sure, without trying to teach the genuine or authentic nature of a true conversion experience. So there's a risk that we have when we overemphasize it. And I think it's a quote from Newen that I use when I talk about conversion as revolution. A true conversion really is and should be revolutionary. It turns the person upside down. And it can turn, as we know, the first Christians did, turn the world upside down. And so, no, not like French Revolution, but actually like personal, individual revolution, and also revolutionizing, a community, a society, a world, as Christianity did. And so, if we really understand conversion for what it truly is, it is revolutionary.
Well, this next question ties in a bit with what we were talking about earlier, between that tension between pietism and enlightenment. But it helped me in thinking through the strengths and the weakness of being an evangelical, in that you write, evangelicalism was and is inherently not conservative, not traditional, but rather innovative and therefore progressive in a social and cultural sense, not necessarily politically or theologically, which again is a tension that's fascinating to me. Evangelicals appropriate from tradition selectively and innovate as necessary in order to fulfill their mission. That was both an insight and in a way kind of a critique that I found very telling, because it shows a certain degree of, it's like you think of somebody going to a scrapyard to find parts for their vehicle, their like classic automobile, which now runs great, but they're taken from this, from that car, or different things. And I found myself thinking, like, I wonder, what does this mean for what is the real strengths or real weaknesses of such an approach to faith? And I wonder, could you unpack that? What would you say this is the strengths and weaknesses when it comes to faith and progress and our sense of mission as evangelicals?
Yeah, well, going back to what I pointed out earlier, that really comes from Molly Worthen, when she said that evangelicals are kind of the first moderns. They reflect what modernity is, and so modernity it basically begins with the Enlightenment, with the idea that reason and human experience can be the measure of truth and understanding, and also, even just the word itself, modern, means of the times, like of the current moment, like something that's modern is of the moment, of the times, which is a radical shift from the pre-modern world, the ancient world, where things, had been the same for thousands of years, and your ancestors had done the same thing, lived in the same place for thousands of years. All of a sudden, modernity comes along and everything changes. It adapts. It's centered in the individual. It's centered in subjective experience and understanding. And that is what evangelicalism is basically is. Again, if we go back to the conversion experience, a conversion is an objective reality, yes. But it's also subjectively experienced. It's something that you experience and you testify to, and that you show in your life, and that you talk about in your life, and that you share in your life. So in that sense, it's something very subjective. And evangelicalism, like modernity itself, is always sort of like of the moment, always moving, improving. I have a whole chapter on improvement, because there's this idea of making things better, which the good Christian version of that, of course, is sanctification. But the sort of cultural, not Christian version of that is improving, self-improvement, being new and improved. And we don't always, see the difference between sanctification, increased holiness, and becoming Christ-like, and the kind of improvement that the world, markets, which is why there are so many Christian self-help books and so many seminars and workshops and online courses and things to teach you to be better, even if it's better as a Christian, which isn't usually, arguably it could be about sanctification, but I'm not sure that it always is. So in this way, evangelicalism has always been about innovation. I mean, again, going back to some of the founders like John Wesley, really important figure in church history. But the reason that he helped bring about so many conversions is because he did this innovative thing of preaching outside, traveling around on horseback, drawing large crowds, including many laborers and poor people whom he deemed worthy of hearing the gospel. That was like radical and revolutionary, to draw these large crowds instead of a minister just staying in his assigned parish church and having enough people come until the walls couldn't hold anymore. He took out, that was very innovative for him to take the message out. So that's wonderful and that's good. But also that shows us that innovation is in the blood of evangelicalism, and not all innovation is good. We have to recognize that tension. And we haven't always done that well.
Whitfield and Wesley saying you're welcome to Billy Graham and company.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued on that, because on that front of innovation, and Barnabas Piper has helped me on this front, because he talks about how sometimes we dislike our church or a church because of a matter of preference rather than something that's on a moral point. And we see this, in the evangelical world, something like the worship wars, where someone is saying, the best thing we can do is keep singing hymns and have a pipe organ front and center. And people are saying the best thing we can do is not sing any more hymns and have a band, and a drum set, front and center. That's just one example, but you see these tensions emerging in the church. And so I'm intrigued to ask, what do you think that is, or what do you think the solution, especially within the context of the church, is to navigating that? Because especially with the advent of the internet, people have more and more accessibility to information and to make their own discernment on different things. And this is my personal opinion, but when it comes down to it, God can be exalted through hymns and an organ, or contemporary songs and a full band. And so what does the church need to be thinking about in order to not let those dreams of innovation or progression versus tradition and familiarity crash head on, and actually keep the church from its true calling and purpose, which, as you noted, is sanctification?
Yeah, no, that is a really good question. And I always resort back to that old saying of like, if I can how does it go now? Knowing the problem is like half the battle, or something like that. That's not exactly how it is, but I really do believe that, and I talk about this in the book. So much of what is wrong is our lack of even awareness of what we should know. Like, we don't know what we don't know. And so if we are moderns. We are living in the modern age, late modernity, post-modernity, whatever you want to call it. We're still modern people living in the modern culture, and that has strengths and weaknesses. I'm so thankful for, for medicine, for vaccinations, for all the things, for things for indoor plumbing and electricity. I love being a modern. There are also, there are weaknesses that come with that, and one of these is that we lack tradition, we lack stability. Oftentimes, just roots in that sense. And so I'm glad that we only don't have just one choice of a church, and it's the parish church. We're in the neighborhood where we live, and we have to go there, and we would never imagine going anywhere else. Like, I'm glad that we aren't limited to that choice. But that also doesn't mean that just floating around and going from here to there is good in itself either. And so we have to recognize, the opportunity and the challenge that each era, each culture brings us, and kind of try to moderate between the excesses of both of those things, which is really the definition of virtue. So, which is another sort of interest of mine is virtue ethics, and just realizing that it's too easy for us as humans to go from one extreme to the other, and just try to avoid those excesses is really what we're called to do in almost every circumstance.
Absolutely. So I'm thinking about your insights on commercialism and evangelicalism, and remembering a time when I went to Kingdom Bound, a big week-long Christian festival in
Wait, have we ever talked about this?
I don't know. Have we ever talked? Have you been to Kingdom Bound?
I lived in the backyard of Kingdom Bound for years. I was at Kingdom Bound all the time. My husband played at Kingdom Bound.
What did your husband, was he a band member for?
Yeah, he was in like a little sort of Christian folk duo, but way back in the day, probably even before you were born. I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
There you go. I didn't know about this. Well,
Wow.
The things you find out.
We lived in Buffalo for years. So
yeah.
like right in the.
Well, right. That's where you did your PhD. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry. I knew that.
No, it's funny, but it's just,
So, Kingdom Bound.
Yeah.
And I realized I was grade 10. Yeah. I think the first time I went, and I realized that there was a bunch of different booths that, one, were Christian colleges and universities, and two, Christian parachurch ministries, Compassion, etc., and that I could find out kind of strategic ways to get free T-shirts, and often it had to do with signing up for information. And I consistently gave my father's email, and then he was subsequently inundated with unwanted emails from them. But
that's a good strategy.
I spent the week getting like a dozen free T-shirts with all manner of either Christian school or Christian, turn or burn classic style logos and statements on them. And as I was, that memory came to mind, because we kind of are swimming in this water where commercialism is rampant in evangelicalism, and it's almost treated as the norm, until you really think seriously about the early church, and that it would have been ridiculous for the Apostle Paul to have like a mug with his face or anybody's face on it. Anyways, I want to ask, like, when you think about that reality, commercialism in the evangelical movement, how would you say it's shaped evangelicalism's sense of identity, the growth of evangelicalism, and especially the trajectory, the direction that it's actually headed in, and whether or not that's even a good and healthy direction?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a big question. And I mean, commercialism is one of the things that most defines, late modern American culture. So it also indicates that evangelicalism and the church have also tended to be defined too much by the culture, right? So we live in a late capitalistic society, and so we are seeing all of the excesses of that in many ways. And we are also seeing that the church has been overly influenced by it. Now, I mean, this is, if we just take commercialism out of it for a second and just talk about culture, I mean, if churches and people and Christians will always reflect their culture. I think it's fine that it's fine that Christians today in America look like Americans, whatever that means, and they don't look like, first century shepherds, right? I mean, that's fine. Now we know that some people, some Christian traditions like pick a period, like in the 19th century or the 1920s, and say this is what we're going to look like and live like. That seems
forever.
Like that seems very random to me, and not very logical. So, in one respect, we have this, God chose to have human beings live on this earth and live in time for this, in between time. And so culture is part of his plan and his design, right? So we can't avoid that. And I think it's perfectly okay for us to look like 21st century Americans if we live in America, or look like 21st century Africans if we live in Africa, whatever. Right. But we still have to look more like the church and more
Mm,
like Christians and culture. And so, can we use technology? Absolutely. Can we, use commercials and employ the techniques of commercialism? Absolutely. But we have to ask the question, like, when is the form overtaking the content? When
mm,
does the medium become the message, as Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman would ask us? That's the problem, is
mm.
when the end or the means becomes the end, or the means just I'm when the ends justify the means.
Right.
That's when we are no longer really following the way of Jesus, and being used by the culture instead of using culture for his glory.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to explore with you the role of sentimentalism in the evangelical movement, especially sentimental art. I really enjoyed that chapter. And there's a few questions here, but part of that is just to help our listeners be able to maybe picture in their minds what this is. So could you unpack, one, what is sentimental art, and specifically, who are some noteworthy 20th century sentimental artists? Because there's one in particular that we're both thinking of that everyone will be able to imagine one of his paintings or two. But especially, what's the danger of sentimental art in that, as you note, it can bring this attempt to divorce beauty or a sense of beauty from actual goodness and
Mhm.
truth. So I realize there's a lot there, but could
Yeah,
you speak
no.
to that?
So sentimentality is emotion, and
Mm,
sentimentalism is, emotion for emotion's sake. And,
mm,
if you know anything about me or my work, like, I'm really fine with emotions, like that. God designed us that way too. I'm not an anti-emotional person. You do see that sometimes out there in the church, but it's about excess. So we have the expression of, like, something that has sentimental value, and when we talk about that, we mean that it doesn't have real monetary value. Its value is like the emotion we have connected to it,
mm,
like it's a souvenir from some place, or it has a memory, and that's absolutely fine. But again, if we recognize it for what it is. But art that is sentimental is art that sort of manipulates our emotions and is valued for its emotional sense. And your listeners, I'm sure, are already connecting some dots there. So it could be like praise and worship music that is just focused on the emotions, and the theology is bad or missing. It can be, the the cheap art or bumper stickers that we see at booths at Christian music festivals. It just kind of, makes our statement, puts it out there, doesn't have a high personal cost for our witness, but just kind of is a cheap, easy way to say or display that we're a Christian. Like, in other words, it's easier to wear a t-shirt saying we're a Christian than to act like a Christian,
mm,
right? That would be another form of sentimentality, I would
mm.
say, sort of a more philosophical one. But one of the artists that I talk about in the book that is exemplary of this is Thomas Kinkade, the painter of light. If you don't recognize the name, I'm sure you would recognize, something that you saw of him. He had a lot of cottages that are warm and glowing, or garden scenes that are, just evoke fuzzy emotions. And people don't necessarily realize, and I didn't until I did some research, that, I mean, all his company is a literal factory,
Mm,
pumping out these paintings using artists and assembly lines, and lots of money involved. And so it's not art that is created through sacrifice or personal cost, or authentic experience. It's just art that sells.
mm,
Um, and it appeals to us easily because it evokes emotions that are pleasant to experience. Whereas art that makes us think or is complicated, is harder for us as human beings.
Mm.
It might, but not. It's we resist it more unless we're, unless we've developed and cultivated a taste and appreciation for art that reflects the complexity of human experience. And so we were talking about sentimental art, but the really important point is not just art, but it's our faith.
Hmm.
Like, if we traffic in sentimentality, whether it's in our art or movies or our worship songs, then we're more likely to traffic in sentimental faith.
Hmm.
That also, chooses the easy emotional experience over the kind of
Mm-hmm.
hard sacrifice and the raw truth of the faith.
It's like Bob Dylan versus the Spice Girls.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good example. Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's nothing, there's nothing wrong with happy clappy dance music. I think
Mm.
that's what the Spice Girls are, or something like. But we have to recognize it for what it is.
Right.
Right. We have to say, okay, I'm in the mood for some happy, this is just an experience of pure, easy joy and happiness. And that's what it is. In the same way that we would say, fast food is what it is,
Mm.
right? Fast
Yep.
food is, something to meet the need immediately. It is not healthy for the long term. It's an indulgence, and it is not something that is sustainable for a good, long, healthy life.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to recognize things for what they are,
right.
So that we can enjoy them in their proper order.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, you mentioned a minute ago that you lived and studied in Buffalo in the Empire State, and I'd love your insights on, as evangelicalism is, I don't know if it's fair to say making a comeback, but kind of making a comeback in the 20th century under the leadership and the influence of people like Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell Sr. I'd love for you to speak to the ways in which the emergence of evangelicals and evangelicalisms as a political force began to shape our understanding of empire in the West.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a whole chapter on empire, and of course, because of my area of academic expertise and experience, I spend a lot of time talking about the origins of evangelicalism in England in the 18th century. But for a lot of people who are more familiar with American evangelicalism, we point to that like mid 20th century, when the word evangelical was made very popular by Billy Graham, and Time magazine had an article, I think in the 60s, about the year of the evangelical. And so American evangelicalism really reached this sort of empire status in the 20th century, when in the heyday of Billy Graham, followed by Jerry Falwell Sr., who built what is now still called the world's largest evangelical university. And then there is this, a book called The Evangelical Empire that talks about that. Another phrase, what he calls the evangelical industrial complex, which is another way of talking about empire and the commercialism that we mentioned before. Evangelicalism is big business. It's big business in publishing, in music, in education, in mega churches. And again, that's power and wealth that can be used for good, and is, I guess, used for good. But we know from so many things that Jesus said and warned us against that that those things and the way of Jesus do not go well together. And so this evangelical empire that we saw really rising in the 20th century also has long roots in the more literal understanding of empire, which was, the expansion of land territories and taking over people and countries and colonizing them. And so I talk about that history in this chapter to show that, that having an evangelical empire rooted in education and megachurch and publishing and music is just a kind of a different version of empire that human beings have been doing, since there have been human beings. And just putting a sort of Christian stamp on it, or the evangelical label on it, doesn't make it any less problematic than any of those other kinds of empire building efforts.
Yeah, ravenously pursuing power, sometimes at the expense of everything else. Well, Karen, you've brought so many insights to bear in this, and whether it's improvement or sentimentality or domesticity or empire and on, you're inviting us to really think carefully and critically about the forces that have shaped what we understand to be faith and following Jesus in the 21st century. And so, just before we wrap up, I'd love to ask. Many say that the church is facing a really crucial moment in history, that what takes place in light of how the church responds to adversity and scandal within the church and more could really have huge repercussions going forward. And some would say, well, it's a reckoning. It's a judgment. That's what it is. And others would say, no, this is time for reformation, for change, for embracing something new. And I'd love to know, what do you say to that?
I say yes. I say both. And we are facing a reckoning. I don't think that's in doubt at all. The only question regarding that is whether or not we will heed that reckoning, whether we will accept that judgment and then reform. I do think, and I say this in the book, I do think that the church is in a 500-year moment. If the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago was over doctrine, as we said before, right teaching, the authority of the Bible, and so forth, I believe this Reformation is going to be over right living, right practice, orthodoxy versus orthopraxy.
Orthopraxy, yes.
Yeah, but it's again, it's not one or the other, it's both. And I think, I'm very much a Reformation person. I'm very much decidedly a Protestant. And so I'm thankful for the right doctrine that came out of that 500 years. It's not perfect, obviously, but I think that what this 500-year moment is showing us is that we weren't always living as a church by that right doctrine. And now is the time to say, okay, we have the right doctrine. How do we apply that to our lives now?
To not confuse the thought that information equals transformation. That's fair to say.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, I love that Karen, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's so much good that can happen if we're willing to grow and change and consider what it is to tangibly express the heart of God to our world. So thank you for this. Thank you for everything you've shared. And I'm interested to know, where can people learn more about you, connect with you online, or pick up a copy of The Evangelical Imagination?
Well, The Evangelical Imagination can be picked up at any of your favorite booksellers, online, in person, independent, or big box. You can get more information about me at my website, karenswallowprior.com. You can find me much too often on Twitter at ksprior. So any of those places, you can find me or my work and connect with me.
Excellent. Well, this has been a lot of fun. So thank you so much for taking the time for this, and congrats on your new book.
Thank you for having me and letting me talk about it.